Welcome to Groundwater Rising. This podcast is all about flooding, with a focus on the forgotten source of flooding, groundwater flooding. Groundwater flooding is the least understood, least monitored, and least reported on. It is often left out of the conversation, so we're a podcast dedicated to changing that. I'm Katie Hargrave-Smith from Project Groundwater, and in this podcast I will be speaking to community members from around the UK who have to deal with groundwater flooding, and industry experts trying to help them. Together, we will uncover the latest research, innovation, and strategies from the water sector, academia, and beyond. Today is all about flood warnings. In England, the Environment Agency provides 3 types of flood warning: flood alerts, which means flooding is possible; flood warning, which means flooding is expected; and severe flood warning, which means flooding could be a risk to life and significant disruption to communities. Additionally, dotted throughout the UK, there are locally managed flood warning initiatives, like one we'll be talking about today. Flood warnings play a crucial role in flood resilience. Each warning level provides tailored advice to help people prepare for potential flooding, and research indicates these warnings can reduce the negative effects of flooding, benefiting both mental health and flood recovery. Today, I want to dig deeper into how flood warnings work, what the future is looking like for flood warnings and general disaster warnings, and of course, groundwater flood warnings. With me today to talk about this topic is Greg Gomez from Three-Sided Cube and John Mackay from the British Geological Survey. Both Greg and John are currently working on the new groundwater flood warning service that Project Groundwater has just launched. Greg, please can you introduce yourself?
I'm Greg from Three-Sided Cube. So we're a software development agency. We focus primarily on any project that works on technology for good. So probably the most relevant for the discussion here is the American Red Cross emergency weather alerts. So it's a similar service for users. It's a mobile app in that case.
Great, thanks. And John, please can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm a hydrologist at the British Geological Survey. BGS is a geoscientific institute. We provide impartial scientific expertise to government, to research, and to our industrial sectors as well. And my role, I'm a hydrologist, or more specifically actually a hydrogeologist, which means I'm really interested in how water moves underground, so in our aquifers. And one of my roles, which is really relevant to this, is in leading our operational groundwater forecasting services. So that's where we develop models to make predictions of what's going to happen in the future. And one of those services that we provide is for early warning of flooding and for Project Groundwater as well. So yeah, looking forward to talking more about that.
While I gave a little bit of an explanation of flood warning in the UK, John, are you able to just go into a bit more detail about what the situation is in the UK, how we handle flood warning and what goes on in the EA?
It's a little bit complicated, to be honest, because, well, particularly for groundwater. So, yes, so the EA they're our water regulators, right? So the national water regulators, and they are in charge of issuing flood warnings, flood alerts to different areas. When water levels get to a certain level, they will issue a flood warning or a flood alert, which is then beamed out to communities around the country, to those ones that are actually potentially going to be flooded, so provide them advance warning of when a flood might actually occur. The EA have, I think it's fair to say, generally really good coverage of providing flood warnings for surface water type floods, things like pluvial flooding or fluvial flooding, so when a river bursts its banks, so if you think of all that water on the surface, when those kind of surface water reservoirs create flooding. So they've got really good coverage for issuing warnings for that type of flooding. The thing that they don't have as good a coverage for is groundwater flooding. So that's where we've got water emanating from underground, so from those aquifers, and actually inundating the surface. They do issue some groundwater flood alerts, but they don't have complete coverage of the UK. So actually lots of areas that are vulnerable to groundwater flooding where those warnings aren't currently issued by the Environment Agency. So we've kind of got 2 different things going on. We've got really good flood warning for this sort of surface type flooding, but for groundwater there are lots of holes in it really.
Yeah, and why do you think that is?
One of the reasons is that groundwater flooding, it's not immediately obvious to us, right? So groundwater is pretty much everywhere. You're probably standing on top of some groundwater. There are aquifers all over the UK that are storing, millions and millions and millions of litres of water. But it's underground, we can't see it, so generally people aren't really thinking about it. It's only when it comes above the land surface and all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, where did that come from? Suddenly groundwater's sort of on the map, if you like. The strange thing about that is that when it comes above the land surface, it looks a lot like pluvial or fluvial type flooding. You get heavy rainfall and the water table rises and inundates the surface. Generally, what people think has happened is that it's rained on the surface, it's run off, it's got into the rivers, and the rivers have burst their bank. So it looks again like your kind of pluvial, fluvial type flooding. It doesn't really look like groundwater flooding. There's a general lack of understanding of when and where groundwater flooding is actually happening, and often it's confused with that surface water type flooding. The other issue is that it generally doesn't occur as frequently as surface water type floods. So pluvial and fluvial flooding is happening relatively frequently throughout the year as well, so in the summer months as well as in the winter months. Groundwater flooding might only happen once every 10 years. It might even be less frequent than that. In some areas it's much more frequent than that. It kind of depends where you're looking. So often it's kind of forgotten about. It happens and then people just kind of forget about it. They think, oh, well, it hasn't happened for a long time, so it's probably not going to happen again. Either people don't know what it is or they just kind of forget about it, really.
And to build a flood warning system, what do you need? So what are the kind of the components that go into building a flood warning system?
So the first thing you really need is a good understanding of the hydrology. You need an understanding of how water is moving within your environment. So rain falls on the ground, some of it will infiltrate into the soil, some of it will infiltrate further down and get into our aquifers, some of it will run off over land, some of it will get in rivers and flow down rivers. And having an understanding of where the water's going is really, really important. So you need that kind of basic background knowledge of, what's going on in your catchment. And that can depend on lots of different things. It can depend on, how the land surface is being used, so whether it's an urbanized surface or whether it's farmland. It can depend on things like the geology. Certainly something I'm really, really interested in is what are the rocks that are lying underneath us. That's really important for, particularly when you're looking at sort of groundwater type flooding. So having that understanding of the system, if you like. The question of how do you then provide early warning, generally the way in which we do it is we build a computer model. So that system that I talked about, the kind of the way that water's moving through the environment, we build a computer model of it, a sort of digital representation of what's going on in a particular area that we're interested in. And with that model, we can then force it to run into the future. So we can actually provide it with patterns of weather, so we can give it sort of rainfall or other kind of weather variables. And the model can then tell us what will happen given that input of rainfall or whichever weather variables it is that we're using. If we've got this kind of computer model, it's essentially a tool. It's a tool that we can kind of prod, tell us what's going to happen in the future, and that gives us the basis for our early warning system, if you like. On top of that, you need a way of communicating that information to the wider public. I might pass it over to Greg on that one.
Sure thing. So we're at a point where we know a certain geographical region is going to suffer some degree of flooding. It may be groundwater is just below the surface, or it is, above the surface in certain areas. We now need to know where our users or the people that want to be notified are. In the case of Project Groundwater, we have a website where users can select the community that they're in. Then they can choose to either receive sort of SMS or email notifications when there are flooding events. So at that point, we basically hold this database of users that want to be alerted and which communities they're part of. We then take that information of, yes, flooding is likely or flooding will occur in this community, and then we queue and send notifications, either an email or an SMS to users telling them, hey, flooding is likely. That will link them to Project Groundwater platform. On the platform, they'll find a bit more information about that event, the severity of it, and then we also have actions that users can or should take given that severity that we've determined for that flooding event. Right now, the actions that we have are broadly applicable to everyone. We have plans for making those a little bit more bespoke in the future.
How do those forecasts work? I mean, this might be quite difficult to explain. How do you get a forecast and know that amount of rainfall, I guess, is one of the forecasts you're looking at, is then going to mean X?
Think back to that kind of digital representation I talked about. So we've got a computer model, right? Underpinning it is essentially a bunch of mathematics. It sort of takes information in, and the information it takes in is actually weather, what has happened in the past. It takes that information in, it does a load of number crunching and all that information, and then it spits out what it thinks will happen to, in this case, to groundwater levels, because groundwater level is the really important variable that we're trying to predict, right? We want to know how high the water table is, and based on how high that is, we could then say how likely we think it is that it's going to flood. So we build these models, build them and test them during periods where we've seen flooding in the past. So we've got some really useful sort of benchmark floods that have happened in the past. So 2000 and 2001, if listeners are old enough to remember that one, that was a really, really big one. And also more recently in 2014, we had a really big groundwater flood event in the Chalk. So in a similar kind of geological setting as Project Groundwater is focused on. So because we've seen those floods happen in the past and we've got measurements of what happened to groundwater levels in the past, we've also got measurements of what the weather was like at the time and what caused that flood to happen. So we can actually run our models over these past events and see whether they correctly predict them or not. And if they do correctly predict them, we can say, all right, okay, we've got some confidence in this model. We think it might be able to tell us something about what happens in the future. So if we then want to be able to say something about what's going to happen in the future, let's say over the next week, next 2 weeks, over the next month, rather than giving it historical weather data, we can actually give it weather forecasts. We can actually take that information and we can put that into our models, and then our models will say, okay, based on what the weather forecast is, this is what's going to happen to groundwater levels. And then from that, we can say something about the risk of groundwater flooding in the coming weeks or months ahead or whatever it is.
With the platform itself, I don't know if, Greg, if you're able to sort of describe it, what it would look like if you were going to go on, what you try and find on there.
Yeah, so you access it through your browser, through a URL, works well on your phone browser or on a desktop or laptop browser. The first thing you'll see is to pick the community. As John mentioned, we're focused on particular communities at the moment, particularly susceptible to sort of chalk groundwater flooding. Once you pick your community, you basically land on the community hub. On this page, you'll have an overview of the current state of that community, whether everything's all clear or if flooding is possible or probable. You'll also see a list of actions that you should take given the sort of current likelihood of groundwater flooding. We also aggregate alerts from the Met Office and Environment Agency. So for your community, if there are any active weather alerts of any kind, you'll be able to find those on the platform as well. And then we also have a forecast map. So we use the forecast that John and his team provide, and we give you an indication of the likelihood of the groundwater level rising or falling in the coming days. But we also have a map. The map gives us an idea of the area that will be impacted given a groundwater level, so which areas may see groundwater above the surface given a certain groundwater level. So this is helpful for people to be able to see a week in advance or in 2 weeks' time, given a rising groundwater level, which area may be impacted in their community. Other things that you can do on the platform, provide feedback. It's very important to us. So if you do go and sign up and you do use it, we absolutely love feedback, good or bad. It all helps us improve the platform.
Yeah, just to add to that, Greg, and you mentioned the kind of mapping of groundwater flooding. I think that's a really innovative. The thing that Greg's describing is essentially a map that you can kind of zoom into, a kind of Google Maps style thing that lights up those areas that we think are at risk of flooding. You can kind of zoom into, your street. Quite a difficult thing to do, actually, to be able to make predictions about where the groundwater's actually going to emanate and where it's going to end up flooding. Just to expand on that a little bit, so it's difficult for us to do that because it's really hard to observe groundwater, right? Because it's all underground. We can't see it. It's this thing that we know it's there, but we can't actually observe it. In reality, what we do is we use a drill and we actually drill boreholes, right? So there's a whole network of holes that have been drilled into the ground all over the country. And then what we do is we put little sensors in them to measure the groundwater level so we can continuously measure where the water table is. And that's really good because we can say at that point where we've drilled a little hole, we know where the water table is. But actually what we found is that if you just go sort of 5-10 metres away from that and drill another one, you'll find it's maybe 10 metres higher than it was next door to it. It's really, really variable. Those little points, really useful information, but they don't actually give us a complete picture about what's happening over the whole of an aquifer, for example. So our forecasts are somewhat limited in that they're generally at that point scale. They're at this kind of borehole scale because that's the only real data we've got. But then there's this extra clever thing that Greg's talking about, which is a kind of extra layer of modelling and interpretation that allows us to extrapolate that out across an area so we can actually start to map out where we think groundwater is emanating. And I think that's a really nice, innovative addition that we've got in this early warning system. And just to sort of name check them a little bit, that's Jacobs who've been leading on that particular component, that sort of mapping component.
And is there anything else new that this flood warning system is trying to bring?
The fact that it has this kind of community focus to it. your average member of the public can actually engage with and interact with. There's a place for them to go to get this information. There isn't anything like this available at the moment. So the other early warning system that we provide, and that's actually, it's a national system, so it's for the whole of the UK. It's national, but it gives a very kind of broad picture. Flooding might happen in this county, or it might happen in, on the east of the country rather than the west of the country. But it doesn't really dial down into those individual streets and actually what matters at the kind of community level. So I think that community focus of this early warning system and particularly the front end component, so the application that public can actually interact with, that's a really new thing. I mean, that just doesn't exist anywhere else.
Yeah, I think the method we always talk about in our industry is like user-centered design, that co-creation element of working with the communities. We put a lot of effort into making sure that it was easy to use. We did testing and, focus groups with members of the community, and particular attention paid to sort of the language that we're using, trying to make sure that it is approachable for everyone. It's very important. I mentioned the feedback thing, that for us is like what we live for. We want people to be using it. We want to build stuff that's easy for people to use and that's easy to understand.
And I feel like I probably should have said earlier that it is a trial system, which is why we're talking about the feedback so much, because this is the first of its kind with this mapping and this forecasting. So it is in trial. And Project Groundwater, one of our core values is transparency, so do feel free to answer this honestly. But what have been some of the hiccups maybe that you found with, and kind of what struggles do you expect when you're creating a system new like this?
I think early on, our expectation perhaps was like, oh, okay, there'll be a groundwater flooding feed and we just need to integrate with that feed, and then we were like, oh no, it doesn't exist. So that was like an early reality check for us. It wasn't super difficult. It was just like, one of those things like, okay, we need to build a feed, we will do that.
I mentioned earlier about this issue that we have, that we can't really observe groundwater everywhere, so we're kind of limited to these individual boreholes. We're always limited by the amount of data that we have available to us. When we start to focus in on these communities, we realise that there is data there, but there's nowhere near enough. We'd love to have more of it. We'd love to have more groundwater level measurements. There are lots of boreholes that have been drilled in these communities, regions, that don't have any kind of monitoring equipment in them, so they don't have those sensors in them. The infrastructure's there, if you like, but we need to stick a sensor in it so we can actually measure what's happening. And if we had that information, that would only make our forecasts better and more useful. With more of that monitoring in place, we could really make this even better.
So is there elements of the flood warning system that you want to continue to develop? Is there kind of plans for the future? Are there key things you can't wait to kind of bring in, but like you said, maybe needs more data?
I think one that's like a quick win, perhaps, like we have the data we need, is it'd be nice to have a little bit more historic data on the platform. It could be helpful to put into context the sort of the numbers they're seeing today. Like, well, how does that compare to the highest it's ever been, like highest recorded, or the 2000-2001 flood? What were the numbers then? Yeah,
because remind me, what's the measurement that we use for groundwater?
MAOD.
Metres above ordnance datum. So ordnance datum, think of it like sea level. So metres above sea level, essentially.
And so a regular person is not going to be able to look at it and be like, oh, it's X number of MOAD. I know exactly what that means in the real world. So I guess, to be like, oh, well, I know what happened 5 years ago when it apparently was at this number. So if it's this number again, I have more of a understanding.
That's exactly it. Yeah, that it is hard, any person to just know how bad is a 10 MAOD, for example. John mentioned about the boreholes and how not all of them have the sensors in them. Something that we've had some thoughts about is also an element of like citizen science in the platform. Are users being able to report when they've seen groundwater flooding? Again, I know that's fraught with challenges of knowing if it is groundwater flooding versus just fluvial flooding. But I think that it could be another source of data. And I think, if it relied on a human to process it, it may not be viable. But with advances in data modeling and machine learning, it's possible that we could still leverage those user reports of flooding somehow and make that another data point that we feed into the models.
Greg, you touched on sort of those reference points of historic events, and I think that's Super, super useful. I completely agree with that. People can easily relate to. They can think back to what it was like then, and much easier reference point than meters above ordnance datum, that's for sure. It's actually useful as well. It's useful at all kinds of levels. And I know, for example, the Flood Forecasting Centre, which is essentially the national issuer of flood forecasts, they're particularly kind of dialed into the emergency responders. So they issue these things called daily flood guidance statements. So every day they're running forecasts and producing these kind of national pictures of flooding. They use these historic events. That's like a really important thing for them, is to look at, okay, well, what is it like compared to when this happened 3 years ago kind of thing. So I think it's that kind of information is really useful at lots of different levels. How we make this better, I think generally we want to try and make the forecasts as skillful or as accurate, if you like, as possible. One of the things we'd really like to do, get a better understanding of how confident we can be in a particular forecast. So if we say levels are going to rise by this amount over the next 2 weeks or whatever, or if we say we think there's a risk of flooding in 2 weeks' time, we'd really like to be able to say something about the confidence we have in that forecast. So that sounds like a simple thing. You'd be like, well, surely you know whether you're confident or not. Well, actually, that's quite difficult. It's quite difficult to figure that out, because these are sort of the unknown unknowns, if you like. A lot of people probably notice, you're getting more and more data on those weather apps now, that quite often they'll have these kind of percentages associated with like rainfall, which is basically a probability of rainfall occurring. The general public are open to ingesting that kind of additional information, so I think we'd really like to bring some of those elements over to these flood forecasts as well.
Is that going to be more difficult with groundwater though? Because obviously to improve confidence you need to have tested it in real world floods, but groundwater flooding, it might not happen. Maybe it stops right now and you don't get it again for 10 years. Are you reliant on flooding to test it, or can you do something without groundwater floods happening to kind of improve that?
We can pretend we're, let's say, 2013, and we're trying to predict what's going to happen at the end of 2013 going into the winter or maybe the spring of 2014. And we can say, right, okay, given the models we've got at the moment, let's put ourselves back in that situation before the flooding happened. Do our models correctly forecast the flood to happen a month in advance of it occurring or whatever? We can test it over these historic periods. The problem we face, and particularly with the sort of onset of what appear to be changes in the climate associated with anthropogenic warming, is that those historic floods might not necessarily equate to what we'll see as we go further on. We might see that things become more extreme, that we see floods that we haven't actually seen before in our historic records. So we're really going to be kind of pushing our models maybe out of their out of their depth, really. The thing we have to do there is we have to be adaptive. We have to be able to adapt our models, to adapt our tools so that they continue to be fit for purpose in the future as we see things like climate change coming into fruition.
One other thing I wanted to mention that we'd love to be able to do in the future is around carrying on the community engagement that we've done. We built in a way for the action plans that are associated with the sort of different flood severity levels to be tailored by each community. So we'd love to get to a point where each community can engage and sort of like customize the action plan so that items are super specific to their communities. They may want to still keep the broad action items that we have, like preparing defences, moving things out of the basement, but they may have sort of specific guidance for members of their community of like people to reach out to, or roads to avoid that they know are susceptible to groundwater flooding. In the focus groups that we ran, it was a consistent point of feedback of there's a lot of knowledge in the communities, there are people that have been through a lot of these events that they can share a lot of insight on how to best deal with it. When actors from outside the community come in, they may not pay as much attention to all that community knowledge.
Because I feel like at the moment, if we did do that, if we did embed much more local knowledge, it does make it also harder to then roll it out across like a wider area, because you'll need that engagement with those people, but then it will make it a much better system.
Yeah, I think technology can still help. Maybe there's a way for people to suggest items that should be added to the action, and that maybe there is a little bit of a manual vetting process before those get published. So I think technology can still help with that. Listening to users and being sort of community led is, I think, an innovative part of the approach. Like it is difficult to scale, but sometimes the right thing to do is something that makes it a little bit harder to scale. One of the advantages we have have of a community focus right now, at least, and not sort of worrying about national scale, is being able to do some of those things that don't scale and really take into account those communities.
And in general, do you think there's more we could be doing with just general disaster warning in the future? Do you think there's elements that we can learn from what we've done on this flood warning system? The government seems to be considering more about general disaster warning, and is there something you think should be considered for the future?
A challenge that I've experienced a lot, and I don't think I've got close to solving, is how to make people care about preparedness. For every sort of ounce of effort spent on people being prepared, it's like a lot of recovery that doesn't need to happen. But it's really hard to get people to care about something in the future that may or may not happen, and to have a plan in place. And trying to scare them into doing it isn't the right way, you know, like people know they should do it, but there's something more important, more immediate. That for me is something that I'm really passionate about trying to solve.
Greg, you touched on this earlier, but that issue of scaling, in the scientific research sphere, if you like, there's a general trend now to kind of take methods that we're applying at the small scale, maybe the regional scale or local scale, and actually extrapolate those out and turn them into kind of national scale things or even global scale tools. There's lots of amazing work that's being done where it's kind of these big global scale analyses. Early warning systems, some of them already are, but more and more of them I think are going to go to this kind of larger national to kind of global scale. That in itself poses potentially a really big challenge, because it's how do you use that information in a way that takes into account the uncertainties, the limitations of applying tools at that kind of level. I think what people want is they want to know what's happening at their house, on their street, you know, what's happening right at their front door. And these kind of larger scale tools at the moment can't say much about that, I'd say. So I think the future is going to be trying to overcome this scaling problem. How do you go from that small scale to large scale whilst maintaining the usefulness of the tool itself?
There's that benefit of having these small scale things, that they are much more localized. You've got that local knowledge. Again, you've probably had some community engagement, people have kind of fed into it. But then equally, you've got the benefit of, if it's a national scheme, is that you just go to one place. Whereas, again, if you're living in one of our study areas that's got this new service, you're signing up to our service. You're also signing up to EA, the Environment Agency's service, as well as if there is any more kind of like new disaster management alert schemes coming out, then you go up and you sign up to that one. And so you've got this issue of, we love all these smaller ones, they're probably better, but then equally it also is a lot more effort for the person. And if we're trying to get people to be prepared, low effort is the best way. So I think it's one of those ones where what's better, is national better because then you kind of got a one place for everything, or is local better, and how do we like mar those two together to get the benefits of both?
It is trying to find the middle ground between the sort of devolved administration model, or, you know, decentralization of certain activities. I feel like makes sense. You know, there's obviously benefits from scaling and being able to train on larger data sets and more data, but then there are benefits of the local, more human approach to other aspects of the program. So I think on the technology side, I do think there is, like, it makes sense to scale, but on the human side, there is an element of, you're not going to get rid of just needing some people on the ground and, you know, talking to people and understanding local problems and make sure their local perspective is still heard. I don't think an AI anytime soon is going to replace the need for those local community heroes, you know.
Actually, the Flood Forecasting Centre is quite a good case study to look at in that sense, because the Flood Forecasting Centre is made up of employees from both the Environment Agency and the Met Office. So they've got these kind of expertise on the sort of hydrology side of things and also the meteorology side of things. Now, they're very much focused at the national scale, and generally they're looking at kind of county level risks of flooding. The nice thing that they do, and something they're doing more and more of in the sort of groundwater flooding realm, is they interact with the regional or the local scale experts in that region. So generally it will be an Environment Agency regional or local office where they've got people on the ground who actually go out and, you know, look to see where the flooding's happening, etc., etc. So they're kind of marrying it up by, they look at the national picture that they get, and then they use that as a way to decide where they need to get more information on potential flood risk, And then they can hone into those particular local groups that have those expertise and then extract the relevant information they need to then bring it back to that kind of national level. That's quite a nice example, I think, of a way that you can combine those two different scales. I do think eventually we're going to be aiming to have something that's, I don't know what it's going to be, but it's going to be integrated in some way. It's going to be a kind of fit for all one tool that does everything at the national to local scale.
And in general, are there any risks that you think that any warning service is going to have, be it a flood warning service or other types?
I think there's a natural caution to have around sort of like any algorithmic approach or any alerting system that just operates on algorithms and logic without any human intervention. There's always a risk there of it spitting something out that unexpected. There's ways of testing for it and monitoring it. That is a risk.
You definitely need that human input. You can't just have something that's 100% automated and just kind of let it run free. Yeah, the other one is probably one I've already mentioned, but I think that climate change and the potential for us to see extremes that we haven't seen before and the implications that has for the usefulness of the tools that we've developed already. There's a risk there that they essentially go out of date.
Is that something that you've witnessed, John, or is that something that you're fearing is coming?
Well, with groundwater flooding in particular, it's really difficult to attribute changes in, for example, flood frequency or flood severity, because there are relatively few of them. They only come around once in a while, and we don't have really, really long data sets. We don't have many very, very long data sets to actually be able to say something about that. To look at the other end of the extreme, so drought, where we don't have enough water, there has been some really nice research that's been done, actually by one of my colleagues here at BGS, and they've looked at 2 groundwater level records from 2 different boreholes that have been measuring groundwater levels from back in the 1800s or something. We've got the longest groundwater level record in the world. Here in the UK, it's in the Chalk, in the south of England. And they've looked at that long record to then look at changes in the severity and frequency and duration of droughts. And you can see it. You can see how that has been changing over time. That's kind of the first step, is detecting that change. Now, the second step of attributing that change to, for example, climate change, that hasn't been done completely yet. One thing that we have done is we've taken some of the models that we have and we've actually put through climate change projections to then look at how things potentially could shift in the future. And for sure, you can see things, they're not going to be stationary. They are going to change as the climate becomes warmer and increasingly variable.
I realised it's just something you said earlier that we've not mentioned, that there is another difference with this groundwater flood warning service in that it has more automation involved. It is more automatic than the existing groundwater flood warning that the Environment Agency runs, where that one is sent out by a person, whereas ours isn't sent out by a person.
Yeah, that kind of sounds like we're going against what we just said. Don't automate things. But I don't think it is. I think it's just you have to be careful about how much of the system you automate. You have to think very carefully about which components can be automated to provide that added value and which components you actually can't automate. You can't necessarily automate the complete interpretation of your forecasts. You need to leave that for people to actually look at. And I think so far we've got that balance right, but I'm sure we'll get some feedback on that at some point.
Yeah. Again, stressing Katie's point earlier, it's a trial. We are trying something a little bit different and hope something that can scale, but it is also one of the risks that we're aware of.
So what have we automated?
Right now, we take the reading from the sensors in the borehole the Environment Agency provides, and we have basically a mapping of if it's this value or above, then it means that, flooding is likely or flooding is imminent. Our alerts are based on the current level and the trend. If it's been going up or if it's been going down, it sends an automated alert. What we're looking at doing in the near future is, rather than using just the current level that the EA has actually measured in the ground, is to use the forecasting model that John and his team are working on. So the ambition is that we can start issuing alerts for forecasted levels rather than actual level today based on, the trend over the previous days. We're confident that approach right now is low risk, but it also doesn't give you much of a look ahead, and we'd like to provide a bit more of a look ahead for people. We want to make sure that we've got that confidence level right, that we can express that to users when we do issue an alert based on a forecast rather than an actual level, that we're also communicating that confidence level to users.
We haven't really discussed the difference between groundwater and river flooding in the way that alerts are sent, how localised they are. Because with ours, yes, we have the map, but you get the alert for the entire area. So it's not necessarily, the alert doesn't mean there's going to be flooding at your house. It just means there is likely to be flooding in the general area. And now with our system, you can go on and look at a map and be like, oh, okay, so this is the risk area. Is it my house? Is it my local area? Is it places that I want to drive through? Whereas currently you just know with the EA, again, it's like this whole area, there's a risk across the whole area, and you kind of use your own personal knowledge of where you know it's flooded in the past. And I know that some of our areas do cover the EA, so we have a crossover. We have the same areas of the EA's groundwater alert and our groundwater flood warning system. And we had someone email being like, oh, you sent me an alert, but I've not had an EA one. Why has this happened? And then we were like, oh, give it a couple of days. And then the EA's alert did go out. But obviously they relied on someone going in, looking at that data themselves and making that decision, where ours went, well, we already know that this is a threshold, so we're going to send it as it reaches it. So again, there is a mix of what is better. Is it better to have it automated, or is it better to have it always checked by a person? But when it's always checked by a person, you're relying on that person being around. One that will be, this trial will help us kind of understand, and obviously funded by the Environment Agency, so we are telling them everything that we learn and decide is good or bad.
That's a really important point, Katie, there, that we've learned a lot from what they're already doing, and them having feet on the ground is such a useful tool. I mean, the EA officers that actually go out on the ground and look to see where flooding's happened, they'll take photos and log them and geolocate them and everything, so you can actually see those areas that flooded. And we can't do that. We don't have time, we don't have the resource to do that. So there's lots of really useful information that they've collected, and lots of local expertise that they have. The key, like you said, is working together and trying to help them kind of push things along, but also for us to push things along at the same time.
My usual question to wrap things up, given that you're both the experts in this area, is there anything you think we've missed when talking about flood warning that you'd want to mention?
So I mentioned that the preparedness thing, having a plan that you know what to do and when it happens, and that you've got your documents all in order, and that you have a way of getting to safety if needed. It may only happen in 5 years, but doing a bit of prep goes a long way to make sure that you and yours are safe, and might put you in a position where you're safe and you can help others stay safe as well.
I guess that is a point. A flood warning system is only as good as the actions people take off the back of it. So, Greg and John, thank you so much for joining me today, and thank you for listening to Groundwater Rising. We're a new podcast looking to grow, so please hit the subscribe button on your podcast provider, leave us a review, and tell your friends and colleagues about us. Do you have a topic you'd like us to focus on Groundwater Rising, or would you like to join me to share your personal groundwater flood story? Please email me on groundwaterrising@projectgroundwater.co.uk. That's all for now. We'll be back on the last Thursday of next month with another episode of Groundwater Rising.